is my pleasure now to introduce to you our first speaker for the evening, Dr. Glenn Sunshine. Glenn Sunshine, if you know him, he is a Reformation historian. He is also Professor Emeritus of History at Central Connecticut State University, Ministry Associate of Reflection Ministries, Senior Fellow at the Colson Center for Christian Worldview. He also runs Every Square Inch Ministries, and he is the member of one of the members of one of my favorite podcasts, the Theology Pugcast, as well as the author of several books, including 32 Christians Who Changed Their World, which you can actually buy at the book table out there in the lobby. He also wrote Slaying Leviathan, Limited Government and Resistance in the Christian Tradition. He plays medieval German bagpipe, but he did not bring it this year. In fact, I think you need to bring it next year, but I think he needs to find an O-ring for it or something. Okay, or gasket. He's also here with his wife, Lynn, who we have really enjoyed getting to know over the last 4 years, because this is actually our fourth time having Dr. Glenn Sunshine with us. So, yeah, we are so thankful for Dr. Glenn Sunshine coming out again, so please do give him your warmest welcome as he joins us.
Thank you. I always look forward to coming out here. You guys are a heck of a lot of fun. What do you do when the world is falling apart? What do you do when it seems like everything's coming apart at the seams and the world is a total mess? I'm actually going to start before the Reformation. I'm going to start with one of my absolutely favorite topics in history: plague. The 14th century was a period of incredible turmoil in Europe. The Central Middle Ages, the period roughly from 1000 to, call it about 1300, was generally pretty stable. It was actually a period of tremendous growth in Europe. European population had more than doubled. There was a huge amount of invention going on, trade going on. It was really, in a lot of ways, almost a golden age for Europe. But then things started going wrong. We had a shift in climate. Yeah, it happens. I know that's a surprise to you, but climate does change. And it doesn't even necessarily have anything to do with carbon dioxide. The climate got colder and wetter. Growing seasons got shorter, which made it harder to grow food. And since European population had more than doubled, suddenly there were crop failures and people started starving. There was, because of the problems with nutrition, there were epidemic diseases that broke out. There was famine. There was a lot of social unrest. People were upset they couldn't feed their kids. And when that happens, people get kind of ugly. So there was a lot of peasant revolts, urban uprisings, that kind of thing. And then in 1347, if you happen to be in Sicily, or 1348 on the mainland, plague hits. And in the space of 3 years, by the best numbers we have today, there's been all kinds of estimates out there, but by the best numbers we have today, 51% of the population of Europe died in 3 years. What do you do? What do you do when the world is falling apart? The reaction is typically, and this is kind of across the board, whether you're in 14th century Europe or anywhere else, when there's a period of crisis, people start saying things have gone wrong. Things have gone wrong on a really fundamental level, and what we need to do is find out why. And we need to go back. We need to go back to find a period, a time when things were going right. And the effect of this in the 14th century is the start of the Italian Renaissance. We think of the Renaissance usually as a period of optimism, as a period of progress and all of those sorts of things. Exactly wrong. The Italian Renaissance was a period that was very much backward looking. The very name Renaissance from the French Renaissance, from the Italian rinascita, means rebirth. A rebirth of what? It's a rebirth of classical civilization. They were going back to the time before the Middle Ages when they thought they had a golden age in ancient Rome. So they're going back. They're looking back to the past because they thought in the past they could find meaning. They could find something valuable. They could find purpose. And this reaction of going to the past in times of crisis is something that, again, it is almost universal in human experience. For those of you who are old enough to remember Ronald Reagan, one of the things that you may remember is a concern about returning to traditional values. Returning to the past, looking to the past, because things have gone wrong and we want to go back to a time when they were going right. Like I said, this is the common reaction throughout human history across culture, with the sole exception of our current situation. In America today, in Western civilization today, we have kind of rejected that reaction, even though we are in a crisis period in many ways. People know things are going wrong. We have rejected our own past. We've decided that our own past is, by and large, we've decided that it was bad, that there's nothing really good about it. And this has cut us off from our source of identity and our source of everything else. So frankly, people are sort of flailing around trying to figure out solutions to whatever it is they think is going on with society. More on that later. But again, this idea of going to the past is generally what people do, because the past is where you find your source of identity. It's where you find your source of meaning. And when things are going wrong, you go back to your roots to find out how to fix it. So the Renaissance is a great example of that. Now, as it turns out, the plague is going to, in a lot of ways, I hate to put it this way, but it fixes a lot of the problems in Europe. Because one of the basic problems that you were facing was overpopulation and inability to produce enough food for it. Well, you can cut out half the population, that really solves the problem. It takes a while to adjust for this. So you continue getting uprisings and social unrest and stuff through the rest of the 1300s. But by about 1400, things stabilize. And for the first half of the 15th century, the first half of the 1400s, things are going generally pretty well in Europe. Standards of living are up generally across the board, and things are generally improving. But about 1450, population begins rising again. And there's a whole new series of disruptions that take place in European society. You're leading into a period called the Price Revolution, where you get these wildly fluctuating things where some commodities are rising in prices, specifically food, other prices are staying stagnant, and there's, again, another period of economic turmoil coming in as you're heading toward 1500. And not surprisingly, you get, again, this idea that things have gone wrong in society, and we need to solve the problem. And fundamentally, they see it as a moral problem. And so what ends up happening is, among other things, they try to solve the moral problem by getting rid of, the people who are generally considered the source of most moral problems, the women. Moving them out of public roles in society. In the Middle Ages, women could run businesses and things like this. This wasn't that unusual. Even in the early 1400s, it wasn't that unusual. But by the late 1400s, there's a push to get women out of public life, to push them more in domestic spheres and leave them there. But this is a concern about public morality, because somehow there's a sense that things are going wrong. When you look at the church had problems all the way through, but by the time you're getting into the late 1400s, the problems are endemic. You've got an incredibly corrupt papacy that everybody knows is incredibly corrupt. The papal curia is corrupt. The bishops, for the most part, are younger sons of nobles who see the job of bishop as a way of promoting family interests and getting rich. When you get down to the level of parish priests, there's a significant number of them who don't understand the Latin of the Mass that they chant every week. They're illiterate. And many of them, even though it's against canon law, many of them have concubines. They're not allowed to marry, but they have effectively common law wives. The bishops who are supposed to be overseeing this don't really care. As a matter of fact, you can go to the account books of the bishops, and they actually have a column in their ledgers for fines assessed against priests for their concubines. They actually encourage the priests to keep concubines because then they can fine them annually and it gives them an extra source of income. This is the level of corruption you see in the church. And everybody knows it. By the way, you do occasionally find bishops who are concerned about cleaning up their diocese. And they will do these things called visitations, where they'll send people around to check on the different churches in the diocese and see how things are doing. And now, I'm not kidding. This dialogue shows up in visitation registers regularly. They go to the parish and they see that the priest is living with a concubine, a common law wife. And they'll say to the parishioners, "Did you know that Father John is sleeping with Mary?" Response, "Yes, of course we do. What do you think we are, stupid?" "Did you know this is against canon law?" We repeat the question, "What do you think we are, stupid?" "Of course we know it's against canon law." "Does this bother you?" "No, not particularly." Now, this got these guys confused. So the obvious question is, well, why doesn't it bother you? Answer, no joke, over and over again. Well, if he's got her, he's more likely to keep his hands off our wives and daughters, isn't he? This is the level the reputation of the clergy had sunk to. They understand there is a moral crisis, a moral problem here. Oh, and by the way, this is also the period in which you get a burst of witch trials occurring. Witch trials are not a medieval phenomenon. They start during the Renaissance. They start during the late 1400s. Why witch trials during this period? Because there was this sense that there was something fundamentally wrong. There was some sort of crisis, and there must be some traitors in our midst that are causing this problem. This is the context in which the Reformation takes place. Because the Reformation starts in the early 1500s. Now, in the cities, by the way, let me add one other thing before we get to the Reformation. In the cities, in particular, there was a concern that the moral crisis that was facing the society was undermining the coherence of the city. There was a desire for what historians call sacral community. If you don't like the word sacral, call it sacred. They wanted to see the cities developing into or being a kind of sacred, holy community. And these kinds of moral failures, moral crises, and this general sense that things were going wrong undermined the sense of sacral community. And they were looking for a way of finding it. And the Reformation is one of the ways that starts providing an answer for that. Now, when the Reformation occurs with Luther, it's worth noting that there were Catholic reformers already in place who were trying to reform the church. A good example is Desiderius Erasmus. Erasmus and other Catholic reformers, Renaissance humanists by training, all of them had as their goal cleaning up the abuses in the church and returning to the model of the early church. The way you clean up the abuses is you get rid of all of the medieval practices that have gunked things up, and you go back to the period before the church started becoming corrupt. Notice what they're doing. They're going back to tradition. They're going back to the past. They're going back to their roots. They're going back to the anchor, just like happened in the Italian Renaissance. They're finding their identity in their origins, in their past, going back to the tradition so that they can fix the problems. Almost the war cry of the humanist was ad fontes, which means to the fountainhead, to the source. We want to go back to the sources. That's that same instinct I started off talking about. Well, Luther comes along, and what Luther says is, yeah, you know what? All of these abuses are there, but your solution won't work. You can't just clean up the abuses because the abuses are caused by bad theology. In order to fix the practices, you have to fix the theology that caused the practices. So it's a more radical approach to reform. Radical from the Latin word radix, meaning root. He's going for a root cause. And Luther's solution is sola scriptura. Go back to Scripture. Scripture alone as your source of theology, as your source of theological conclusions. It's the only definitive way of getting theological answers. What is he doing? He's going ad fontes. He's going back to the fountainhead, to the source, the root. He's going back to the past. He's going back to the original origin of Christianity. He's going back, well, that same thing. He's going back to the fountainhead, to the source. And that is what is triggering the Reformation. It is that insistence on sola scriptura, studying Scripture in its own right, and coming to the conclusions about salvation and about all theological practices on the basis of the original sources of the faith. Now, this, as I said before, provides an opportunity for a new approach for developing sacred communities in the cities. And as it turns out, you get a different style of reform in the urban centers than you do in Lutheran territories. The difference being, Lutheranism tends to spread primarily in larger territorial states, like Saxony, large area, a lot of rural areas. There's some cities like Wittenberg and others, but a lot of rural areas and things like that. They're large territories. When you get to the Rhineland, where there are a lot of cities, or in Switzerland, where you have effectively city-states, a city that controls the surrounding rural countryside, where they're really urban-centered, you get a very different style of reform happening in those areas. And the reason for that is, well, there are a couple of reasons. One of them is that these are areas that have high levels of literacy, unlike the territorial areas like Saxony, where most of the people are peasants and can't read. The cities have a pretty high level of literacy. And as a result, there is a demand for a more word-centered approach to reform. You want the fancy word, it's logocentric. Okay, logocentric, word-centered form of reform. What Luther does, for example, in Saxony, what he does is he takes the Catholic Mass, he takes out the parts of it that he thinks are theologically wrong, like the Hail Mary, and translates it into German, but otherwise he keeps the Mass pretty much intact. What happens in, say, Zurich with Zwingli is he will say, no, that's not what we're going to do. We want the service to be focused on preaching. We want it centered on preaching. Luther thought preaching was important too, but nowhere near the degree that Zwingli did. We want the service centered so much on preaching that we're going to strip down the liturgy. We're going to make a really bare bones liturgy. We'll still have a liturgy, but we'll keep it really bare bones. We're not going to go with all the things that they do in the Catholic Mass. We're going to have a much more simplified liturgy to keep the focus on preaching. Because we want a word-centered, a more rational approach to worship. Along with that, by the way, we don't want anything that's going to distract from worship. So we're going to take out the stained glass windows. They're a distraction. People are going to look at the pretty pictures rather than listening to the preaching. We'll take out the organs too, because the organists tend to put in all kinds of flourishes that people will listen to rather than paying attention to the preaching. We will have the congregation sing, which the Catholics didn't do, but they're going to sing the Psalms, because the Psalms are scripture. So we're going to keep the word in the music, but they're only going to sing Psalms, and they're only going to sing it a cappella. We're going to take the statues out too, for the same reason that we're removing the stained glass. So, by the way, the Reformed tendency not to like images in churches has nothing to do originally with the Second Commandment. It's originally to avoid distractions. The Second Commandment was an excuse that they found later to make it conform with sola scriptura. So, just so you understand this. I'm going to get myself in trouble one of these days, but we'll let it go. No, I will not do additional commentary on that now. And let's do one other thing. Let's take another look at how we understand the Eucharist, how we understand the Lord's Supper. What does Zwingli do? Zwingli argues that the Lord's Supper, now we get Zwingli wrong all the time on this. Zwingli argues that what happens in the Lord's Supper is that Jesus is not present in any way in the elements themselves. Luther and Zwingli both reject transubstantiation, the idea that the elements miraculously turn into the physical body and blood of Christ. But Luther says that Jesus' body and blood are included with the elements, that the body and blood are present with the elements. Zwingli says, nah, that's not it. Jesus is spiritually present there. He is actually taking, if you will, a lower view of communion than Luther is, and turning it into a more, intangible, rational, spiritualized thing, removing the physical component in a very real way, removing the physical component from the grace. It does argue that grace is there, but it isn't as directly tied to the bread and wine as it is for Luther. This is all part of this increasing emphasis and focus on this word-centered thing. The sermon is the key thing. Up to this point, for over 1,500 years, the celebration of communion was the centerpiece of Christian worship. Zwingli is saying, no, it shouldn't be. It should be the preaching. And in a lot of ways, he is really kind of de-emphasizing. He'd probably deny that, but really, I think he's kind of de-emphasizing communion a bit. Still thinks it's important, don't get me wrong, but it is no longer occupying as central a location. So you get this logocentric thing, and this is going to spread not only from Zurich, but it's going to spread all through the cities on the Rhineland. And this becomes the basis of Reformed Christianity. But there's another component here as well that's important. I mentioned that the cities are concerned with this idea of sacral community. They want to develop this idea of a sacred community, of a holy community. They're concerned about immorality. They're concerned particularly about public morality, and they want to see the cities cleaned up and turned into a truly holy community. And so what you also see happening in Reformed churches is a growing emphasis on various ways to encourage and enforce moral behavior in the cities. And now, we have to be careful here. Luther is equally concerned about this. He wants to see moral behavior, wants to see Christian behavior. But he sees this as more a function of the magistrate and simply a function of preaching within the church. He doesn't put any institutional mechanisms in place to try to encourage or enforce Christian behavior other than through the magistrate. Whereas Zwingli and within the Reformed tradition, they begin to develop systems for various kinds of church discipline. This can be formal mechanisms of discipline the way we understand it, but for Martin Bucer, for example, in Strasbourg, discipline for him meant effectively what we would call discipleship. Discipline is everything that you do to encourage people in living out their Christian life. But this is a process, this is a mechanism that he tried to build into the churches. The magistracy opposed him on this, so he had trouble with it. But he passed this idea on to one of his younger proteges, a guy by the name of John Calvin. And Calvin will institute this in Geneva through an institution in the city known as the consistory. And the consistory's job was to oversee mostly public morality in the city, but also religious practice, and to take action where things were going wrong. So initially, the first few years when the consistory is operating in Geneva, what you will find is the vast majority of their work has to do with correcting people's religious practice. So they would bring people in, sometimes just to ask them questions about what they're doing in terms of religion. Do you pray? You know, when you pray, what do you say? Do you know the Ten Commandments? You know, do you know the Creed? And actually, if you look at the dialogue in the consistory registers, we actually have pretty good records on this. You'll find things like, okay, you know, Jacques, what do you pray? Yes, of course I pray. Well, what do you pray? Pater noster qui es in celi sanctificator nomen tuum. Hold on 1 second. That's in Latin. You are a cobbler. Do you know Latin? No, I don't. Well, then why are you praying that? Well, that's what the priest taught me. No, you need to learn to pray that in a language you understand. So go learn it in French or Savoyard, whatever. Okay, all right, I will learn that and I will start doing it in French. Okay, do you say any other prayers? Well, yes, I do. What else do you say? Ave Maria. Hold it. You know, you run into this dialogue a lot. And so you'll see this going on for a few years, but after a few years, that sort of dies out. After that, what you see is a concern increasingly for issues of particularly public morality. So within the city, you've got the city and the countryside. Within the city, primarily what you're seeing are issues having to do with, public disorder. And this ranges from people who are being drunk and disorderly. I remember one case, I actually transcribed consistory registers as part of my work as a grad student. I remember one case where somebody was brought in for being singing loudly at night and being drunk, and his defense was he was singing psalms. There was another one who was brought in for being drunk and loud, and he said, well, his friends had abandoned him, and he just accidentally found himself in front of the house of Monsieur Calvin. The wrong place to be. But so you've got that sort of thing. You have quarrels inside households that become loud enough to become public knowledge, that start causing public offense. You have things of this sort that are emerging. Why? Because they want a sacral community. You know, if a husband and wife are quarreling and it's quiet and it's inside the house, they're not worried about that so much. But when it gets out into the streets and when it starts causing a public commotion, public offense, starts being an element of scandal, starts turning into gossip and things like that, that's what they're worried about. So they start working on these kinds of things, and the effect of this is that ultimately it transforms the city of Geneva. John Knox wrote a letter home to a friend of his, a Mrs. Locke in Scotland. And he wrote to her and he said, you know, there are many places where the true gospel is preached, but the only place where it is lived is Geneva. Because the effect of the consistory's work in discipline in the city completely transformed the city's public morality, and he changed it to a place that was remarkably different from other cities. And this had the effect, in many ways, of ratifying Calvin's theology. The effect of this was that people who studied in Geneva, a lot of refugees came to Geneva. Those with talent were trained as pastors and then sent back to their home countries. And seeing what happened in Geneva convinced them that Calvin's theology was correct, that what he was doing was right, because it worked. They saw the results. And so they would go back, and wherever they went, Calvin's theology followed, and consistory-like institutions followed. When you go to France, which is where was the focus of my graduate work, when you go to France, you have instances where the Huguenots, the French Protestants, mostly Calvinists after the 1540s, they are a persecuted minority in the country. The crown doesn't like them. The crown wants them gone. And you get instances where there are communities in France who write to the king. They send letters to the king. We have the letters where they say, before the gospel came to us, it was not safe for people to walk the streets at night. Now, since the gospel has come to our community, women and children can walk around any time of day or night and no one molests them. Why are you telling us this is wrong? Why are you telling us this is a bad thing? This is the effect of the true gospel on our community. It changes the community. It creates the sacral communities that the cities in the late 1400s, moving into the 1500s, were longing for. It creates the very thing that they had been hoping to find. And it's a combination, again, in the urban environment, it's a combination of logocentric religion, which means a focus on preaching. As a matter of fact, in the consistory in Geneva, when you've got issues of people not following correct, not knowing enough about religion or not following correct practice, most often what they're told to do is go listen to more sermons. Okay. A lot of people think that the consistory was really strict and handed down really severe sentences. I don't know what you think of listening to sermons, but in any event, that word, go listen to more sermons, learn it. So you've got this emphasis on that, an emphasis as well with reason, understanding the faith, understanding what's going on. But along with that, let's put it into practice and let's make sure that people are behaving, that they are living in accordance with true doctrine and proper practice. And that combination creates the kind of sacral communities that people were longing for. And it is one of the main reasons we see why Calvinism in particular, which we normally call Reformed Protestantism, why Calvinism is spreading. I think people underestimate the importance of the disciplinary side of this. The point of this is that the thing that made Calvinism succeed, the thing that made it really work effectively, was the fact that it produced communities that made demands on people. It produced communities where there was a firm commitment to truth, a firm commitment to truth anchored very deeply in the Christian tradition, but also that had, along with that firm commitment to the Christian tradition, this side of a set of expectations for how people should live and how they should behave. Now, it's worth noting in terms of the firm commitment to the Christian tradition, what does this mean? When we talk about sola scriptura, let's just pause for a moment here. We don't mean that you read Scripture and you only read Scripture. That is what Vishal Mangalwadi, who you'll hear from later, refers to as solo scriptura. The Bible is the only thing that you read. Nor does it mean that you read Scripture and interpret Scripture just on the basis of what you see in it. The idea of sola scriptura is itself anchored, as originally understood, is itself anchored in tradition. We usually think of tradition as being something that the Catholics do, Protestants don't. That's true in a sense, but it's not true in another sense. Heiko Obermann, who is one of the great historians of the Reformation in the late 20th and early 21st century, wrote a book called The Harvest of Medieval Theology. And in it, he argued that the Reformation is really an outgrowth of medieval theological movements. And one of the things he pointed out in there is that when it comes to this idea of sola scriptura, number one, it doesn't mean what we usually think it means, and number two, it's found in the Middle Ages. He traced the idea of where do you find this idea of tradition as a source of authority in church? And he went all the way back to the early church. And what he said is, when you read the early church fathers up till about St. Augustine, call it roughly 400, the church fathers are all uniform in pointing to Scripture alone as the source of authority in the church. They don't consider themselves of equal authority with Scripture. It's Scripture. But there is an additional element here. It's what they called the rule of faith, Latin, the regula fide, the rule of faith. And what that is a set of interpretive principles, if you will, that guides you in your reading of Scripture. They're things like the creeds. The best way to understand the way the regula fide works is they're guardrails. So if, for example, you interpret Scripture in a way that contradicts the basics of the creed, you interpret Scripture in a way that says that the Trinity is not true, that there is no Trinity, you're getting it wrong. That's what the regula fide means. If you read the Scriptures in a way that says that Jesus isn't God, you're getting it wrong. Okay, so it's sola scriptura, but sola scriptura with the interpretation guided or bounded by the terms of the regula fide. Starting with Augustine in the West and Basil the Great in the East, you begin getting an argument that tradition has a kind of authority that's independent of Scripture. This is going to start floating around as well. By the time you're getting to about the 13th century, the Franciscans are going to be arguing that tradition is an equal and separate authority from Scripture. They're both co-equal authorities. But the older idea of sola scriptura, that Scripture with the regula fide, is also in play in this period. So when Luther comes along and says Scripture alone is a source of authority in the church, this isn't a new idea. It is an idea that was actually current in his day, and he was coming down on one side of a theological argument that was already going on within the church. Okay. So once again, even sola scriptura has this anchoring in this idea of the regula fide, has this anchoring within tradition. When you come to reading Luther, or especially reading Calvin, both of them really, you will find that a lot of their writing is not just simply expositions of Scripture. You will find that their writing is absolutely laced with references to early theologians. As a matter of fact, you can actually, if you read Calvin's writings chronologically, you will know which theologians he was reading, because he keeps referring to them. He read a lot of Augustine. He read a lot of Bernard of Clairvaux. He read a lot of other theologians. He is writing his theology, and he is being influenced by earlier theologians. He doesn't completely reject every Catholic theologian out there. He disagrees with Catholics on a number of points, but he says that there are a lot of good things that Catholic theologians are saying that are correct. And he is very free about using them and citing them as sources in his own work. So what he is doing is he is going back and finding the right things in the past, the right things in the tradition, and drawing them forward and using them as he is working on his approach to reforming the church. So we're in a period of crisis. What do? We go to the past, we find the good stuff that's there, and we use it to help figure out what we should be doing in the present. So, to tie this together, let's look at the present. Let's look at the world today. What we see in the world today is a situation where I think we would all probably agree the world's a mess. There's a lot of stuff that is going on that is, feels like a lot of things are falling apart at the seams. The problem that we face in our society is when you Well, frankly, if you look at the society as a whole and you say, what do you do when the world is falling apart? The most likely answer you'll get is you panic. Because you see, there is no clear answer to that question. As a matter of fact, there's no clear answer to the question of what does the world falling apart at the seams means? Where are the problems? What is the problem? I don't know if you've noticed, but when you look at the way the culture operates, it's sort of like a cat with a laser pointer. A few years ago, the problem was critical race theory. The problem was race. Racism was the big problem in the country. Then the problem wasn't race, it was gay rights. Then it's, no, that's not the problem anymore. Now it's transgender. And every time you've got a new problem, you forget the old problem. We don't know what the problem is. It keeps shifting. We know something is wrong, but culturally, identifying what the problem is keeps changing. And the reason it keeps changing is that the society doesn't have any roots. Or to be more precise, the society has rejected its roots. The society has said that everything about our past is wrong. Western civilization is evil. America is a colonial power, which, by the way, is utter nonsense. All right, let's just pause here. America is a colonial power. All right, what is the mother? The American West is colonial. Okay, we have taken the land from the natives, and it's all colonies. Okay, right? You've heard that argument. It's especially prominent in Canada, but we got it in the U.S. too. What's the mother country? What's the mother country? Where are the colonies? How do the provinces in Canada or the western states in the US function in any way like colonies? Answer, they don't. Colonies are things that are detached from the mother country that supply either population or resources to the mother country, and to which the mother country sends manufactured goods and so on. That's how colonies function. That doesn't happen here. They're not colonies, they're conquered lands. Let's just call them what they are. And every people in the world, including the native peoples, recognized right of conquest. They did it themselves. So this kind of thing is nonsense, but somehow we've gotten people to believe it. So we no longer view America, in a large sense, as in any way a positive thing. American or Western values, culture, and all of that is considered a negative. So we no longer have any standard by which there's nothing to go back to. There's no standard to identify what the problem is even. So we've got the laser pointer hitting whatever the current cause du jour is. And as a result, we have no opportunity to find a solution because the problem is constantly shifting. We can't even define that because we can't define who or what we are. Now, that's one option. The other option that we get culturally is what Jacques Ellul calls the political illusion. The political illusion says that the solution to all of our problems, and actually the nature of all of our problems, is found in politics. If we get the right person in government, or the right party in government, or whatever, we can solve the problems politically. Bad news. The fundamental problems are not political. Chuck Colson used to say, the kingdom will not arrive on Air Force One. And another Chuck-ism, politics is downstream from culture. And what that means is that although government policies can educate the public, Roe v. Wade, for example, is what established the idea that abortion is a right, which is now embedded in the popular imagination. Obergefell is what established the idea that same-sex marriage is a right, Prior to Obergefell, that was an unpopular idea. Once Obergefell passed, it's like, oh, well, I guess it is. Although that is true, the only reason why Obergefell especially happened is because the public, in a lot of ways, especially elite culture, was already in that camp. Generally speaking, law and court decisions follow the public. And what that means is that if you look at the trajectory of public opinion and things like that, you can anticipate that law and court decisions will follow it. And what that means is that no matter who gets elected, unless the cultural trajectory changes, sooner or later, the political and legal realities will follow that trajectory. So, what's the solution? Well, the solution I would suggest is, well, it's not a solution, but it's what do we do in light of this? What do we do when the world is falling apart? Well, the answer is found in what people have traditionally always done. It's to look to our roots. It's to, well, I would also add, particularly in the Reformation, it's to look to the idea of sacral communities. What we need to do, I would argue, is look to our own past, look to tradition to guide us in terms of what is real, in terms of what is true. And we need to build thick communities, resilient communities, sacral communities, anchored firmly in the Christian tradition, knowing the truth and living by the truth. But not just, all right, we have to be careful here because when you read the book of Revelation, if you read chapter 2, this is a series of 7 letters to churches. The first church is the church of Ephesus. The church of Ephesus, Jesus commends the church because of their purity of doctrine, because they don't tolerate false teachers. And yet Ephesus is one of the only 2 churches in Revelation that Jesus is basically threatening to destroy. Why? Because they've left their first love. They are not living out what the truth of their doctrine tells them. They're not being the light of the world to their community. And because they're not being a light, Jesus threatens to remove their lampstick, which is symbolic of the church itself. So it's not enough to simply hold on to firm doctrine and truth. That's important. Jesus commends them for that. It's important, it's foundational, but we need to go beyond that. We need also, we need to be anchored in the tradition in that sense, but we need also to take that next step to build a sacral community, to build a thick, resilient community that makes demands of people. We need to have grace too, of course, but we need to have communities that actually make demands on people, that have expectations for them, that have expectations on how they live, that have expectations of being different from the world around them. Because if we don't do that, what will inevitably end up happening is we'll become Ephesus. We may hold to the doctrine right, but we're going to become indistinguishable from the world. And eventually, the world will suck us in. Because it isn't enough just to believe. That turns into an intellectual exercise. If you don't live it out, ultimately, how you live really reflects what you really believe inside. So we need the bottom line is we need communities that are going to make demands on people and live out the faith. It's worth noting that sociologists of religion have noticed that the religious communities that survive are the ones that do make demands on people. The ones that are the least demanding, that are most like the culture, are the ones that tend to lose members. The ones that thrive are the ones that do make demands. We need to build this idea of sacral community. This doesn't mean closed off like a monastery, but it does mean that we need to, the border should be permeable, but we should set clear expectations for members. And again, showing grace. We don't want to be, we don't want to be legalistic or anything like that. That's not what I'm saying. We need to be showing grace to people when they fail, because they will. But still, we should have a clear set of expectations. It's worth noting that every religious reform in history started in an intentional community. Monasteries initially, and then after, up to including the Reformation. And then after that, things like the Methodist societies. And the reason for that is values are formed in community. The church gets corrupt when it adopts the values of the world. And as a result, you need an alternative community to inculcate a new set of values so that people can come out of that to reform the church. That's what monasteries did. That's what Methodist communities did. I would argue that just like you need these alternative communities to clean up the church, the same kinds of alternative communities can then provide the seedbed to reform society as well. But they've got to be communities that are committed not to reforming society, but are committed to Jesus first. We can be salt as preservatives and things that give good flavor to the world. We can be light, illuminating truth and revealing lies. We can be leaven, giving life and structure to the culture. This is what Jesus had told us to do. This is what the commands of the gospel are. This is what happened during the Reformation. This happened in Wittenberg. It happened in Zurich. It happened in Strasbourg. It happened in Geneva. And then it spread from there to the whole world. Go thou and do likewise. Thank you.